Good evening. Friends, if you find peace in tonight's story, feel free to gently click subscribe and let me accompany you to sleep, night after night. Tonight, we are not going somewhere grand. No palaces. No scholars in tall hats debating philosophy. No ships crossing distant seas. Tonight, we go somewhere much smaller, much warmer. We are going to a kitchen. A low-ceilinged, smoke-darkened, completely ordinary kitchen on a hillside in Korea, roughly 1,000 years ago. And the person we are following is a woman whose name history never recorded. She is a farmer's wife, a village woman. She knows which wild greens to pick in which season. She knows when to lift the lid of the fermentation jar and when to leave it alone. She knows how to feed a family of 5 on what the mountain and the field provide. This is her story. Or rather, it is her day. Settle in. Let the lights go low and come with me. Before the roosters. You open your eyes and there is nothing to see. True darkness. The heavy, close, kind, not the pleasant dimness of a room with curtains, but the absolute black of a house with no electricity, no gas lamp, no candle burning. The year is somewhere in the Goryeo period, the dynasty that ruled the Korean peninsula from 918 to 1392. Nearly 500 years. Right now, in this particular village, on this particular hillside, it is very early morning, is less than Hashon, 5 hash is greater than, cold, quiet. The only light you can see is a thin thread of orange coming through the gap in the wall from the neighbor's oil lamp next door. You sit up. The floor beneath you is a woven grass mat, not a mattress, not a raised bed. Just grass over packed earth. Your quilt smells of salt and damp. This is the smell of everything here. The sea is not far away. Its moisture finds its way into cloth, into wood, into the spaces between your joints. You reach for your clothing in the dark. Your hands know where everything is. The first task of every morning is the fire. There are no matches here. No lighters. To start a fire in early Goryeo, you use a Times Bousset doll, a fire striker, and a piece of flint, and dry pine needles, and patience. You crouch at the hearth. The hearth is built of yellow clay and river stone, blackened by years of smoke until its surface is the color of old iron. There is an iron pot set into it. You arrange a small nest of pine needles at the base of the firebox. Then you strike. Once. Twice. A spark catches. A thread of smoke rises. You lean in very close and blow, slow, even, barely more than a breath. The flame lifts its head. You sit back. The fire begins its morning work. You ladle water into the pot. Then you turn to the clay jar in the corner and measure out 2 handfuls of grain is less than has-hone. 5 hash is greater than. The grain is not white. It is pale yellow, uneven, still wearing some of its hull. Mixed in with it, a handful of small millet, a handful of barley. This is what ordinary Goryeo people ate for breakfast. Mixed grain porridge. Pure white rice, the kind ground smooth and polished clean, was for the palace. For officials with land and grain stores, not for a farm family on a hillside in a village of 15 houses. In truth, pure white rice was probably less nourishing anyway. The milling that removes the husk also removes much of the nutrition. The rough grain your family eats is more honest. In its way, you tip the grain into the heating water. You stir it once with the long wooden spoon. Then you reach for the small jars. 1 handful of dried mountain greens gathered last autumn, tied in bundles, hanging from the roof beam alongside strings of dried radish. A pinch of those, too. Everything goes into the pot. The hearth in a Goryeo farmhouse was not simply a place for cooking. Quietly, it was an engineering achievement that most visitors never thought to examine. The smoke from your fire does not go straight up through the roof. It travels first through channels dug beneath the stone floor, warming the flat rocks underfoot before it exits through a chimney at the far end of the house. This system is called times ondol, floor heating, from a single cooking fire. The warmth spreads through the whole room, rising up through the stone, and into anyone sitting or sleeping on it is less than has-hone. 5 hash is greater than, as the fire settles into its rhythm. You can feel the floor beginning to warm beneath you. Gently, slowly, like a large hand placed flat and held there. You have sat on this floor every morning of your life. And every morning, that warmth arriving is still something. The jars. You wrap your coat around your shoulders and step outside. The sky is just beginning to separate from the hills, a pale gray line along the horizon, the color of ash. The air is cold and clean. It carries the particular clarity of mountain mornings. Your feet find the packed earth of the yard, At the well, you draw up a bucket of water. You drink a few careful handfuls, cold, mineral, a little sweet, and then carry the rest back toward the house. But you stop first in the yard, because here, arranged along the southern-facing wall, are the jars. Every home in this village has them. Yours has 7. They are large, rounded, deep brown, fired clay, each one capped with a ceramic or wooden lid. Some have smooth sides. Some have bands of rope pattern pressed into them before the clay dried. They sit in a row, unhurried and permanent, like old friends who have been waiting and are perfectly comfortable with that. These are the times ongi times the fermentation jars. And they are, in many ways, the most important thing your family owns. More important than the furniture is less than hazon. 5 hash is greater than. Perhaps more important, practically speaking, than the ox your neighbor keeps. You lift the lid of the largest jar. A cloud of complex fragrance rises, deep, layered, alive. Not unpleasant, but unmistakably ancient. The smell of something that has been quietly transforming for months. This is times doenjang, bean paste. The process of making it is one of the longest recipes in the world. First, soybeans are cooked until very soft, then mashed into solid blocks, meiju, and hung in a ventilated place to ferment naturally for several months. When the surface turns white with beneficial mold, the blocks are broken apart and submerged in salt water in a large jar. More months pass. What eventually rises to the surface becomes soy sauce. What settles and thickens at the bottom becomes times doenjang. Both products, same jar, same process. One slow transformation. In truth, the whole thing takes the better part of a year. You ladle out a small amount of the paste into a ceramic bowl. This is today's seasoning. Then you move to a smaller jar and draw out some of the darker liquid, thin, deep brown, intensely fragrant. The soy sauce. Quietly. The times, doenjang times, jars carried a significance that went beyond cooking. A family's paste was considered a reflection of the household's luck and virtue. If the fermentation went wrong, if a batch turned sour or strange, it was not merely an inconvenience, is less than hazon. 5 hash is greater than. It was seen as an omen. Something was off in the household's fortunes. Neighbors would notice. Neighbors would have opinions. Quietly, at length. So the women who managed the jars managed them with tremendous care. They monitored the smell on warm days. They watched the color. They covered jars with pine branches or placed charcoal near the lids to keep away whatever influences might disturb the fermentation. Whether or not such measures worked is not the point. The point is the attention. Every good jar of paste was the product of a year of patient watching, and a village woman's reputation was built, in no small part, on what her jars contained. Breakfast. You bring the soy sauce and paste inside. The porridge is ready. The pot makes a low, steady sound, gul, 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 soft and reassuring. You dissolve a spoonful of thyme's doenjang thymes into the grain. The smell changes immediately. The neutral, starchy warmth of cooking grain takes on a new depth. Salt. Fermentation. Something old and settled. Not spectacular, but honest. The kind of smell that says morning. Food. Continue. You set the bowls. Porridge of mixed grain. A small dish of radish kimchi pale. Not red. Not spiced. A small dish of soybean sprouts dressed with soy sauce. In truth, this table looks sparse. But in truth, a Goryeo farm family eating like this every morning was a family doing reasonably well is less than hashon. 5 hash is greater than. Below this level, plain barley water. No seasoning. No accompaniment. That was the other side of ordinary. Your family of 5, yourself, your husband Seokju, 2 half-grown children, and your mother-in-law eats from a grain store that is roughly 3 parts barley to 7 parts rice in ordinary months. On festival days, the ratio shifts. More rice. Sometimes half and half. The rest of the time, you manage. You pick up your bowl and take a slow sip. The barley has gone slightly sticky. The millet has sweetness. The Times, doenjang Times holds everything together, that low, rounded, fermented depth that no amount of salt alone can quite replicate. A bite of the cold, crisp radish. You set the bowl down. Adequate. Real. Yours. The women and the jars. After breakfast. After washing the bowls in cold water and tipping the wash water onto the kitchen garden. Nothing wasted. Not a drop. You tuck 2 clay pots under your arm and walk to the neighbor's house. Kim Dae-soo's yard is already busy. 4 women are arranged in a rough circle. surrounded by radishes, cabbage, and several varieties of greens. The air smells of salt and crushed garlic. Today is a communal pickling day. You may be thinking of the bright red kimchi you know from Korean restaurants, vivid, spicy, complex. In truth, that version does not exist yet, is less than has-hone. 5 hash is greater than. Chili peppers are native to the Americas. They will not reach the Korean peninsula until roughly the late 16th or early 17th century, arriving via Portuguese traders, traveling through Japan, crossing the sea. The year is roughly 1000 CE. The chili pepper is still 5 or 6 centuries away. The kimchi being made today is white or pale yellow, cool, lightly sour, deeply savory, but not hot, not even slightly. The method is this. The vegetables are washed and cut, then rubbed, thoroughly and firmly, with coarse salt which draws out their water and begins to soften their structure. The salted vegetables are packed into jars, covered with salt water, and layered with garlic, ginger, and spring onions. Some households add a little mountain pepper. Then the lid goes on, and the waiting begins. Days pass. The vegetables release more liquid. The bacteria in the salt brine begin their work. Slowly, a gentle sourness develops. Clean, bright, alive. This is Goryeo period times kimchi. The word itself is old, but the thing it describes will keep changing for centuries still to come. You notice Kim Dae-soo adding something to her radish mixture, a small handful of dried shrimp, ground to a paste in a stone mortar. This is the beginning of something important. Goryeo cooks had already discovered or inherited from earlier traditions that salted, fermented seafood added to vegetables during pickling, transformed the final flavor entirely, is less than has-hone. 5 hash is greater than. The small fish and shrimp, broken down by months of salt and time, produced a liquid of extraordinary depth. Jeotgal, it was called. Fermented seafood paste. The ancestor of the fish sauce and shrimp paste that would become essential to Korean cooking. In an age without MSG or stock cubes, this was the closest thing to a flavor shortcut. A single spoonful could do what? A pot of plain vegetables could never quite manage alone. The tradition of adding times, jeotgal, times to kimchi, started here, in jars like these, in yards like this one. And it never really stopped, even after the chilies arrived. even after every other ingredient changed. The fermented seafood stayed. 1,000 years of practice, quietly present in every jar of kimchi made today. Kim Daisu talks while she works. She always does. The radishes this year bigger than last year's. Much bigger. You nod, pressing your radish pieces into the jar in neat layers. A younger woman nearby says that her mother-in-law has tried a new addition to the brine this year. A technique from the South. Pear juice. Grated ripe pear. Strained. Mixed into the fermentation liquid. Supposedly, it creates a kind of sweetness at the back of the flavor, a roundness that plain brine doesn't have. The older women exchange glances. Skeptical, but interested. How would it taste? She says, sweeter. Softer is less than has hone. 5 hash is greater than. You consider this. Try it with 1 jar. You say. We have extra this year. If 1 crock goes wrong, it doesn't matter. This exchange, women gathered in a yard, discussing small adjustments to a recipe, passed down from their mothers, is one of those moments that history books never mention. But this is exactly how fermentation cultures evolve. 1 kitchen experiment at a time. 1 willing neighbor. 1 small jar of pear juice. Over time, this communal pickling tradition would grow into something much larger. In the Joseon period that followed Goryeo, it would develop into Time's Kimjang, the great autumn kimchi making event, when virtually every woman in a village gathered together for days to prepare the household supply for the entire winter. An entire community's winter nutrition, organized and prepared by the collective effort of its women. Kimjang times would eventually be inscribed on UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage, but the shape of it, the circle of women, the pile of vegetables, the jars waiting to be filled, already existed here. 1,000 years earlier, on a hillside, on a morning like this one, noon, making Time's tofu. The sun reaches midpoint. The pickling is done. You carry your jars home. Fit the lids. Press a heavy stone on top of each one, insurance against wind, and dust the salt from your hands. You look at the sky is less than has hone, 5 hash is greater than, then at the mountain behind the village. Then you make a decision. You will make tofu today. Tofu times came to the Korean peninsula from China. The exact timing is still debated among historians. The most commonly cited estimate is the 12th or 13th century, transmitted through the close trade, and cultural ties between Goryeo and the Song dynasty. Some scholars suggest even earlier, since Goryeo and Song were already exchanging scholars, monks, and goods by the late 10th century. In truth, the exact date may never be settled. What can be said is this: in the village where you live, tofu exists. It is not yet an everyday ingredient. It is more like something made on good days, a small occasion, because the process is real work. You soaked the soybeans last night. They have been sitting in their clay bowl all morning, absorbing water, swelling, changing from small, hard things into something rounded and yielding. You pour them into the stone mill. The mill is a flat cylinder of granite, a handle on one side. You push it. Slow circles. The soaked beans feeding through the center gap, emerging from the edges as thick white liquid. Do you? Soybean milk. After perhaps a quarter of an hour, your forehead is damp. The stone mill does not hurry. You pour the raw soy milk into the large pot and heat it over the fire. As it warms, a thick white foam rises is less than Hazon. 5 hash is greater than. The smell that fills the kitchen is warm and green and slightly sweet. The smell of raw soy, cooked open. You skim the foam. You strain the hot liquid through coarse cloth, stretched over a wooden frame, separating the pure milk from the time's bejibbery, the okara, the spent grain. Don't discard the okara. Mixed with time's doenjang, it is a dish in itself. Now, the critical step. From a small jar, you measure a portion of time's gansu, salt brine, essentially, and dissolve it in a cup of water. This is the coagulant, the thing that causes protein to gather into curds. You pour it carefully into the hot soy milk in a slow, steady stream. You stir quickly, 3 or 4 circles. Then you stop. You wait. After perhaps 15 minutes, the liquid is no longer uniform. Where there was smooth, white milk, there are now white clouds, soft, billowing, gathering toward each other, like something deciding to become solid. Tofu curd. Sunu. You ladle it gently into a wooden frame, lined with cloth. You fold the cloth over the top. You place a flat stone on it. The weight does its quiet work. The liquid presses out. Slowly, the curd compacts, takes shape. You lift the cloth. A block of tofu. Its surface carries the texture of the cloth, a faint crosshatch pattern. The color is not the bright white of modern processed tofu. More ivory is less than has-hone. 5 hash is greater than a little rough. The tofu of someone who made it themselves, from beans grown in their own field. You cut a small piece. You dip it in soy sauce. You eat it. The flavor is full and round. The taste of the soybean itself, concentrated and direct. The texture is somewhere between soft and firm, denser than modern silken tofu, less smooth, but with more to say. With the soy sauce, it is quietly excellent. The rest of the tofu goes into the afternoon soup. Doenjang jjigae, bean paste soup with tofu and radish, is one of those combinations that appears to have arrived essentially complete, and then declined to change very much. Goryeo kitchens were making it. Joseon kitchens made it. Modern Korean households make it today. The proportions have shifted slightly. New ingredients have joined over the centuries. But the fundamental structure, fermented bean paste, good stock, soft tofu, a handful of greens, has remained recognizable across 1,000 years. Some things settle into correctness early and simply stay there. Into the mountain, the soup is simmering. The fire is low and steady. There is half an hour before it needs attention. You take a worn bamboo basket from behind the door. Tuck a small sickle into your belt and walk out of the village. The mountain behind the village is not dramatic. It is not the kind of mountain that inspires poems is less than Hasson. 5 hash is greater than. It is simply a mountain, forested, gentle, sloped, thoroughly alive. In May, the hillside is fully green. Plants of every description crowd into each other, filling every gap. The air smells of wet earth and something flowering, faint and sweet. You walk quickly. Your feet know this path. The first thing you gather is thyme's gosari, bracken fern. In early spring, the young shoots are tender, tightly coiled, just unfurling, green and slightly furry. You snap off a large handful and tuck them into the basket. Gosari thymes has been eaten on this peninsula for as long as anyone knows. Blanched quickly in boiling water, dressed with soy sauce and a little sesame. It is one of the most enduring dishes in Korean cooking. Simple, mineral, slightly earthy. A taste that belongs to the mountain. Next, you find thymes, doraji, the root of the bellflower. The root is pale and branched, pulled up with some effort from the rocky soil. Raw, it tastes of mild bitterness. But bitterness, here, is not a problem. it is a beginning. Rubbed with salt to draw out the bitter liquid. Rinsed. Pressed. Then dressed, the root becomes something clean and savory. You also cut a small bundle of a narrow-leaved herb with a sharp, grassy fragrance, something between wild chive and spring onion. The cultivated version in your kitchen garden is milder, larger. This wild one is more intense, is less than has hone. 5 is greater than, more itself. Higher on the slope, you find a pine tree with a low branch. You pull it gently toward you and search among the clusters of needles. Pine nuts. You pick carefully, one at a time, pressing each tight cluster, feeling for the seeds within, and collect perhaps a small handful in the pouch at your belt. Pine nuts occupied a particular position in Goryeo and later Korean cuisine. They were not an everyday ingredient. They were a finishing touch, scattered over porridge, pressed into the surface of rice cakes, ground for their oil. In palace cooking, they were a constant presence. In village cooking, a treasure worth the climb to find. For your family, a handful of pine nuts will flavor several days of breakfasts. You also find chestnuts. Not fresh, it is not autumn, but some of last year's harvest. Dried and stored in a stone hollow, you have used as a cache for 3 seasons now. Chestnuts were essential. Ground to flour, mixed with grain flour, added to rice while cooking. They provided calories in a form that kept through the winter. And they were sweet in a natural, undemanding way, the sweetness of thing that grew without anyone planting them. Your basket is full. You shift the weight on your back and begin the walk down. On the way, you notice something in a narrow gully, wild ginseng. 3 thin roots, pale and forked, growing in the shadow of a mossy boulder, is less than has hone. 5 is greater than. You dig them carefully with the small sickle handle, trying not to break the roots. In Goryeo, ginseng was already understood to have strengthening properties. It was not yet the globally traded commodity it would become. But in a mountain village, finding wild ginseng was genuinely fortunate. You wrap the roots in a dock leaf and tuck them carefully into the bottom of the basket. Tonight, perhaps, in a thin broth, or dried and saved for winter, when the cold becomes serious and the body needs more than grain to manage. Sukju comes home. The afternoon is still bright when you hear the sound of someone on the path. Your husband, Sukju. He is broad-shouldered, dark from the sun, carrying a shoulder pole with a basket at each end. The baskets swing slightly as he walks. From them comes the salt smell of the sea. He sets them down in the yard. You look inside. Several yellow croaker, fat and silver-eyed, still smelling of the water. A mass of small silver fish, barely longer than your finger. A few flat fish you don't recognize. At the bottom of one basket, fresh sea kelp, dark green and slippery, and a small cloth bag of something white. Coarse sea salt. Sokju is not a fisherman. But your village is not far from the coast. A morning's walk. Perhaps a little more. The men of the village take turns. Sometimes they cast nets themselves is less than hashon. 5 hash is greater than. More often they go to the coastal villages and trade grain, dried mountain goods, handwork for fish, salt, and dried seaweed. This exchange was one of the quiet foundations of Goryeo's rural economy. Mountain households and coastal households needed what the other had. Neither could do entirely without the other. A simple arrangement, but one that had to function perfectly every season, every year, or someone went hungry before spring. You look at the fish and make quick decisions. The best of the yellow croaker, 3 of them, fresh and firm, go into a bowl covered with cloth. Tonight's dinner. The rest of the large fish are split, their insides cleaned, rubbed inside and out with coarse salt, and laid on bamboo racks to be placed on the rooftop to dry. The small silver fish, every one, go into a clay jar with a great deal of salt. You stir the mixture thoroughly. You lid the jar. In several months, after fermentation has done its slow dissolving work, these small fish will be unrecognizable as individual creatures. They will be a paste, thick, darkened, intensely savory. Jeotgal. A spoonful of this will season a whole pot of vegetables. The sea kelp you rinse and hang from the eaves to dry. Dried kelp is a foundation. Broth. Soup base. A flavoring for rice. It will earn its space in the kitchen many times over before it runs out. Evening. The yellow croaker. By the time the light begins to turn golden, the soup has been simmering gently for hours, is less than hashon. 5 hash is greater than. The times duenjang jjigae times is ready. The tofu has softened into the broth. The radish is translucent. You prepare the fish. You score the sides with 3 diagonal cuts each. Press coarse salt into the flesh, and lay the fish on the iron grate over the dying afternoon fire. Almost immediately, The kitchen changes. A different kind of smell now, not the deep, fermented warmth of the soup, but something sharper and more urgent. Fish skin against hot iron. Oil releasing. Sputtering. Dropping onto the coals below with a soft times zhizhi times sound. The skin tightens. The flesh firms. The cuts open slightly, showing the white interior. In 7 or 8 minutes, the yellow croaker is done. The skin is dark gold at the edges, slightly charred at the fins, the flesh still just yielding at the center. Dinner comes together. Mixed grain rice. A bowl of times, doenjang jjigae times with tofu and radish. The grilled yellow croaker. This morning's pickled radish. A small dish of blanched bracken dressed with soy sauce. For the mother-in-law, whose teeth are no longer reliable. You pull the fish from the bone and stir it into a thin porridge. She accepts the bowl without a word, which, in its way, is thanks. The 2 children eat the fish with the focused enthusiasm of people who know it doesn't appear every night. Their faces and fingers become comprehensively oily is less than hashon. 5 hash is greater than. Sokju tells them twice to slow down. Neither time has any effect. You eat last, as you generally do. A little of everything. The fish is good. The char at the edges adds something. The croaker has a sweetness in the flesh that the sea salt brings forward. The soup is quiet and deep. The bracken is earthy and honest. The pickled radish, cool and sharp, cuts through everything else and makes it all taste more like itself. Then Sokju says, between mouthfuls, Mongol soldiers again. North of here. The room is briefly still. Your chopsticks pause. The children don't understand. They go on eating. You pick up your bowl again and ladle more porridge into the old woman's cup. The Goryeo dynasty had a long first chapter, several centuries of relative stability. Buddhist culture flourishing. Trade with Song China active and fruitful. Then the 13th century arrived. The Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan's successors, turned its attention to the Korean peninsula. Invasions began in 1231. They continued for decades. The Goryeo court eventually submitted, becoming a vassal of the Yuan dynasty. For the common people of this village, for families like yours, the Mongol era meant uncertainty that arrived and departed without much warning. Sometimes it was distant. Sometimes it was very close. You did not need to understand geopolitics To understand that is less than has hone. 5 hash is greater than, quietly. The Mongol presence changed Korean food in ways that lasted. The Mongols were pastoral people. Their diet centered on meat and dairy, great cuts of mutton and beef, fermented mare's milk, dried meat for travel. They did not particularly observe Buddhist restrictions on slaughter. When Mongol officials and soldiers settled in Goryeo, they ate what they always ate, and they brought techniques with them. One of those techniques was grilling. Large pieces of meat over open fire, direct, simple, intensely flavorful. Goryeo cooks began adapting this approach with local ingredients: soy sauce, garlic, sesame oil, used to marinate the meat before grilling. Some historians trace the origins of Korean times bulgogi, thinly sliced, marinated, grilled beef, to exactly this meeting of traditions. The Mongols also brought something that would reshape Korean social life for centuries: soju. Before the Mongols, Goryeo people drank times makgeolli, the unfiltered rice wine, milky white and gently alcoholic, slightly sweet, slightly sour. It was low in alcohol, comfortable, sociable. The Mongols knew distillation. They had learned it from Central Asian and Persian traditions, and they built distilleries in Goryeo, particularly in the region around Andong, which remains famous for its times, soju times, to this day. For the first time, Koreans had access to genuinely strong alcohol is less than hazon. 5 hash is greater than. The village here still drinks times makgeolli, times mostly. But times, soju times, has appeared. The seller at the market carries it in small ceramic bottles, priced several times above the rice wine. Sokju looked at it for a long moment last time. He did not buy it. You did not mention noticing. The market. 2 days later. It is market day. In Goryeo's rural regions, markets were held every 5 days. Oiljang, the 5-day market. They rotated between villages along a circuit, so that each settlement had a market nearby, roughly twice a month. For a woman who rarely left the village, market day was something real, not just for the commerce, for the information. Who had moved? Who had been ill? Which road was flooded? Which trader from the coast was carrying something good this season? You prepare your trade goods. A small jar of Times doenjang, a packet of dried bracken, several of the festival rice cakes from last night's batch. You want coarse salt, a length of rough cloth, and, if luck is willing, a small bottle of sesame oil. The market gathers on a flat ground near a river, perhaps half an hour's walk away. When you arrive, 40 or 50 people are already arranged in rough clusters. An old man sells fresh bean sprouts grown indoors, needing no field, no sunlight, only water and patience. Bean sprouts were, in this sense, the most democratic food available is less than Hazon. 5 hash is greater than. Anyone with soybeans and a clay pot could grow them. Noble or farmer, they ate the same sprouts. A large woman sells pickled vegetables, 7 or 8 varieties, each covered with a leaf in a small bowl. Her arrangement has the confidence of someone who has been doing this for decades and knows her product is good. A man sells dried fish on a rope, a string of them, 4 different sizes, swaying gently in the breeze. And in one corner, slightly separate from the rest, as though requiring a small category of its own, a traveling trader from elsewhere. His cloth holds things you have never seen in this village. Dark, dried berries, strange, pale roots, small tied bundles of something fragrant, and at the center of his display, a small cloth packet, carefully folded. White crystals. That is refined sugar, imported from China. The price he names produces an audible silence from everyone gathered around him. You look at the packet. You look at the price. You move on. Honey and malt syrup are sufficient. Refined sugar is someone else's world. You complete your trades. The Times Doenjang Times for a small packet of salt and a piece of rough cotton cloth. The dried bracken for a small jar of sesame oil, dark, fragrant, earned. You carry the sesame oil home the way you would carry something fragile and irreplaceable, which it is. Night. The children are asleep is less than Hashon. 5 hash is greater than. The old woman lies still under her quilt. Sukju sits at the door for a while, looking at stars, listening to whatever the night sounds like when the work is done. Then he comes inside. You wash the last bowls in cold water. You run your thumbs over the wrinkled tips of your fingers. You set the bowls face down on the hearthstone. You walk to the door and look out. The moon is large tonight. It sits above the hills and spreads its light over the whole yard. The fermentation jars stand in a row in the moonlight. Patient, silent, waiting for their processes to complete on their own schedule. Somewhere in the village, a dog barks once and goes quiet. The mountain breathes. The creek continues. You go inside. You add one last bundle of wood to the hearth, enough to hold the warmth until dawn, and lie down on the mat. The floor is warm beneath you. The sounds of your family's breathing fill the small, dark space. In truth, everything you did today will happen again tomorrow, and the day after, and for the rest of this year, and next year. The fire to start, the grain to measure, the jar to check, the mountain to climb, the fish to salt and dry, the soup to watch. Quietly. This is the texture of most lives, throughout most of history. Not dramatic, not eventful, just the accumulated weight of small, necessary tasks, performed well, day after day, until they are no longer tasks, but simply what life is less than has-hone. 5# is greater than somewhere tonight, in the great walled city of Song China's capital. People are eating in restaurants that stay open past midnight. Candied fruit on sticks. Noodles in spiced broth. Dumplings in 20 varieties. In Japan, in the old capital, court nobles are being served lacquered boxes with rice in careful geometric portions. In the Mongol encampments to the north, fires are burning and large cuts of meat are turning on iron spits. None of that reaches here tonight. Your world is this valley, this hillside, this kitchen, these 7 jars in the yard, the mountain that provides, the creek that keeps its promise, the family inside this small, warm house. Over time, the jars in your yard will be the most durable things about the world you lived in. The palace of Goryeo will eventually fall. The dynasty will end. The Mongols will withdraw and return and withdraw again. Languages will shift slightly. Borders will be drawn and redrawn. But the times, Donjang times, jars will remain. Not these specific jars, but jars like these, the same shape, the same process, the same smell rising when the lid is lifted, will sit in Korean yards for another 1,000 years. The paste will be made the same way. Soybeans, salt, thyme, no shortcuts. And the breakfast soup, du, jang, jigai, will be eaten tomorrow morning in the city where your descendants live, in an apartment with electric light and running water and a gas stove, by someone who doesn't know your name, but eats what you ate and calls it home. You close your eyes. The fire in the hearth settles. The floor warm beneath you. Outside, the jars breathe in the cold. The mountain is quiet. The 1,000 years ahead of you are full of things you cannot imagine. For now, this room, this warmth, these people, this is enough. It has always been enough. Sleep well.